This is going to be a response to a user named Mojosideburns, who's an absolute nobody, but I was thinking I needed to make a video like this anyway, so I might as well do one now that I have an excuse to respond to this person. He starts off by saying, there's a very large percentage of the world that is racially ambiguous. Okay, yes, there's also some bodies of water that are ambiguous as to whether or not they should be labeled a lake or a pond. There are some geological formations that are not clearly either a hill or a mountain. Does this mean we should get rid of the terms hill or mountain or lake or pond? No, that's dumb. Also, if you mix colors together, you can get different colors. Therefore, red and green don't exist. Right? No, that's dumb. Okay, then he says, the races are not just black and white. There are many other races. Yeah, I never said that. Like that all of humanity could be called black and white. God damn it. However, most of the racial statistics do compare blacks and whites, and so that's why I talk about them the most. Then he says, the vast majority of people have traits from a different race or different races. And yeah, that's true. I don't know what this is supposed to mean. I have some traits of chimpanzees. I have 5 fingers and 5 toes. I have opposable thumbs. I have eyes. I have respiration. I have a nose. You know, I don't know what this is supposed to mean. We're talking about aggregate differences between, aggregate populations, and especially as it relates to politics and the politics of income inequality between the aggregates. And then he says, evolution happened, and the races differentiated by adapting to their specific environments. I guess trying to imply that there's no one is inherently superior or inferior, which is not something I've ever said. And I'm making that inference from a statement because he never said this. And yeah, right. Different populations adapted to different environments, and that's why they develop different brains. And this makes me think that this person, Mojosideburns, lacks a theory of mind, as though I would dispute something like this, or that I didn't know that the races, evolved in different environments. So, yeah. Then he says, race mixing has occurred throughout history, and yes, paint mixing has also occurred throughout history. Okay, I don't know what that means. Also, anti-race mixing laws have occurred throughout history. I can say things happen too. And he says, I come into contact with people of all races all the time, And that's cool, so do I. I live in Los Angeles, in the greater Los Angeles area. It's a pretty big area, so it's not like you know where I live by saying I live in Los Angeles. In fact, back when I lived around a bunch of white people, before I moved to Los Angeles, I had a much more positive view of blacks and Hispanics than I did once I moved. I believe this is because of how blacks and Hispanics are portrayed in the media. That is, they tend to be portrayed as noble, as disadvantaged, as doing the best with what they got, right? And being unfairly profiled and discriminated against and stuff like that. My personal experience with hundreds of blacks and Hispanics has changed this view, or changed this view a while back, and that actually prompted me to look into this whole race thing. But don't take my word for it. It's actually become a bit of an embarrassment for the civil rights establishment that white kids in integrated schools have worse views on other races than white kids in all-white schools. That is, integration has increased negative racial views among whites. That is, in short, familiarity does breed contempt. The contact hypothesis has been proven wrong. And a bit of a tangent. Sometimes, what a lot of these people will do is they'll say, well, the contact hypothesis hasn't been proven wrong because there's been conflict in these schools. That is, what they'll say is that they'll say, well, contact reduces animosity between groups if it's in a non-confrontational environment. And what they're saying is that, well, in these integrated schools, there has been a lot of conflict between whites and blacks, therefore the contact hypothesis is not disproven because it's not, peaceful, harmonious contact. But of course, that you see how that's stupid, right? Like the idea is that if they come into contact, they will be peaceful and harmonious. Like that, they have to basically assume the very thing that they're trying to prove with the contact hypothesis. Basically, any reasonable person will see that the contact hypothesis failed, and that in terms of race, familiarity breeds contempt. Okay, then he says, culturally, white Americans have more in common with black Americans than African-born blacks. This is debatable and disputed by various people. I'm kind of agnostic on that, but it doesn't really matter because American blacks vote overwhelmingly for wealth redistribution schemes or systematic theft schemes. and they vote overwhelmingly for racial privileges for their race, and racial privileges in what? In government contracts, government jobs, the diversity mandates on jobs, and affirmative action in schools. So, I mean, yeah, that's still problematic. Whether or not they're African, whether or not they have quote unquote my culture is largely irrelevant, because there's really only about 100 people that I actually know and that I actually care about, and who I actually care about what they think. Right? It's called the Dunbar unit. I would recommend look up Dunbar's number. So what the intrinsic culture of black Americans versus black Africans, it doesn't matter, because politically they're indistinguishable. And that's all that matters to me. He then says, there isn't a single gene that says black people will behave one way and white people will behave another way, but there is a complex interplay between nature and nurture. Oh, right, I never said anything else. Men tend to behave one way, women tend to behave another way, though culture can inflame or dampen these innate tendencies between the genders. Innate tendencies also exist between the races, meaning that given a similar environment, the different races will on aggregate behave differently. Then he says there's no way to quantify it, and I assume he means there's no way to quantify the genetic component of behavior, and this is stupid, right? What if I proclaim that women are innately less violent than men? Well, we can look at existing violent crime differences between men and women, but you could just say, well, that's because of culture, right? Look, boys are raised to play war games, and they're raised to watch violent TV shows. Therefore, it's cultural. How could you quantifiably prove that men are innately more violent than women? You can't. Right? You can make inferences from facts and logical interpretations about those facts, but you can't prove it. Okay. Now, I use that example, which is of something obvious, like the men being more violent than women, in order to set up this point. Blacks are as more violent than whites as men are more violent than women. Why should we assume that the higher black violence is a result of culture, while the higher male violence is a result of genetics? Now, perhaps culture inflames violent tendencies that populations already have, but, you would have to show evidence of that. Okay, you would have to, restrict access to violent media and violent friends of various people, and see how violent the behavior of these groups are in adulthood compared to some control group, right? You have to control the environment. Because it could just be that the violent media and culture is caused by the innately violent characteristics of the population in question, be it males or blacks, or especially black males. Okay, right? The causation could mostly go the other way. That is, it is the innate characteristics of blacks and males that cause the violent culture, and that the violent culture doesn't really have much of an effect on the behavior of blacks and males, right? And that's what I believe. So you would have to actually show something like that, but of course you can't. Right? Okay, then he says generalities don't apply to every individual, right? As if, yeah, I never said they did. You're making shit up about what I said. Then he says, if it doesn't apply to every individual in that group, it's essentially meaningless. Wow. One thing to look at, you're retarded for saying this is really dumb. Insurance companies, what they'll do is they'll take a look at like smokers. Smokers tend to be a little bit more unhealthy in some ways or another. They'll take a look at whether or not you're overweight. If you're overweight, you're more likely to get heart disease. Now, it's not true. Not every individual who's overweight does not get heart disease. Every individual who smokes does not get lung cancer. Okay, but because of the probabilities, the insurance companies are going to make you pay more because of those characteristics about you. Or let's take perhaps an even more obvious one. Let's say you're concerned about the safety of a nightclub, for example. Okay, you have limited resources as the owner of a nightclub. You can't keep an eye on every single person in the nightclub. Now, given that black males are about 50 times more likely than white females to commit a violent act, okay, because blacks are about 7 times more violent than whites, and males are about 7 times more violent than females, given that males are about 50 times more likely than white females to commit a violent act, who are you going to monitor? White females or black males? Okay, the answer is obvious. You're gonna profile the black males. That is the smart thing to do. That is the rational thing to do. More importantly, politics. Okay, there is racial income inequality between the races, and you know about this. Why is there this racial income inequality? Is it because of environment, or is it because of genetics, or is it a mixture of both? And to what degree are other races still responsible for correcting this inequality at this point in history? Now, pay attention right here. You need to listen here. When you control for average IQ score, the black-white income gap goes away, meaning that on average, a black person and a white person of a similar IQ earn similar incomes. Now, you can say the income inequality is a result of culture, discrimination, the effects of past discrimination, or some other environmental variable. You could say it's something like that. You can also say that the IQ gap is a result of bias in the test. However, it would be an incredible coincidence that both society and the IQ tests are precisely equally unfair to blacks. It is much more likely that neither society nor the IQ tests are unfair to blacks. And it's more likely that the current income inequality reflects real differences in real productivity. Okay, that's much more likely than these biases being precisely even. Okay, therefore, racial preferences to blacks are unjustified. You say I am for passing judgment on individuals based on group generalizations. Sort of. I'm for profiling, right? I'm for keeping an eye on black males as opposed to keeping an eye on white females. I mean, if that's what you mean, then yes. If you're talking about legal judgment or denying of economic opportunities based on group generalizations, no, that is not true. That is not only not true, it is the opposite of true. I am for eliminating legal privileges based on race, right? Legal privileges that treat each individual differently based on their race, which is also known as affirmative action. Then he says, I challenge you to prove that the standardized test scores are more a result of innate differences than environment. You can't do it. He keeps saying you can't do it. Well, yeah, you can. One thing we can look at twin studies. Identical twins reared apart have IQs that correlate more closely than fraternal or non-identical twins that are reared together. This is evidence that differences in genes are more important than the differences in environment within the U.S. overall. We can also look at the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study. This is where they took some black, white, and mulatto children and placed them in white middle-class families. The study was funded by the Pioneer Fund, admittedly, but the study was actually run by Sandra Scar, who is an avowed racial creationist, or, behaviorist, egalitarian, whatever you want to call them, like you. In it, it was found that blacks scored at the bottom. Mulattoes, half white, half black, scored in the middle, as you would expect from, these genetic generalizations. And the whites scored at the top. The adopted whites scored above, the blacks and mulattoes, obviously. But the non-adopted whites were actually at the tippy top.